Hello students, today we will be covering a topic in general psychology which is called as perception. Let us see what are the objectives of this particular lesson are. So, the main objectives in this lesson are to understand, to know the difference between sensation and perception, to understand principles of perceptual organization. Now, let us talk about what exactly is sensation and perception. In our day-to-day life, we come across many sensations, and out of those sensations, we tend to perceive only few. For example, if you are sitting in a classroom and there are so many sensations bombarded towards you, such as sound from a jerky fan or some music being played in the college, but still you tend to listen to the lecture given by your teacher, isn't it? Which says that even though there are so many sensations around, we tend to perceive or interpret only few. Can you imagine a world without sensation and perception, and how it would be? Don't you think there will be a lot of chaos and confusion with so many sensations, and with that certainty we cannot make meaning of the situation if we are not able to perceive and interpret it. Now, let us talk about what are sensations and perceptions and how they influence each other, and what are different principles of this particular perceptual organization. Coming to sensation, sensation is concerned with the initial contact among organisms and its physical environment, which majorly focuses on explaining the relationship between various forms of sensory stimulation, which includes electromagnetic sound waves and how these inputs are registered by our sense organs such as eyes, nose, tongue and skin. All of these sensory experiences are based on a complex processes occurring within the nervous system. Although we are continuously bombarded by various forms of physical energy, including light, heat, sound, smell, and our brain cannot directly detect the presence of these forces, and instead can respond only to intricate patterns of action potentials conducted by our neurons, which are also called as special cells within our bodies that receive, move and process sensory information. These neurons are highly specialized cells called as sensory receptors, which are located in our sense organs and are responsible for accomplishing the task. Thus, sound, smell, sight and what all we experience are actually the product of transduction, which is a particular concept where the process in which physical properties of stimuli are converted into neural signals that are then transmitted to our brain via specialized sensory nerves. Sensation is also called as a process by which we tend to receive information from environment, and the kind of information received is in the form of stimulus, which is a detectable input from the environment such as light, vision, sound, hearing, and even the chemicals in terms of taste and smell, etc. And apart from these, there are environmental information which exists in many forms, for which a physical stimulus must be introduced. For example, air vibrations, gases, etc. It is also seen that our senses respond to a limited range of environmental stimuli, and some physical stimuli that our bodies are sensitive to. For example, we take light as experienced through our vision and sound as experienced through audition. In contrast, perception is concerned with identifying the processes through which we interpret and organize this information to produce conscious experience of objects. It is very important to remember that perception is not simply a passive process of decoding incoming sensory information. And if this was the case, we would lose the richness of our everyday stream of conscious experiences. Perception is the process of selecting and identifying information from environment, and it is the interpretation of the information from the environment so that we can identify its meaning, whereas sensation, if you see, it usually involves sensing the existence of a stimulus, whereas perceptual systems involve determination of what that particular stimulus is. So, both sensation and perception play a very important role, such as when we see or hear, there is more than the raw sensations. that stimulate the receptors in our eyes or ears and other sense organs, but instead we see recognizable objects and hear understandable words or music. In other words, the transmission of sensory information from sensory receptors to the brain is only part of the picture, and equally important is the process of perception and the way in which we select, organize and interpret sensory input to achieve a grasp of our surroundings. According to Johnson and Dark, we cannot absorb all the available sensory information in our environment, and we selectively attend to certain aspects of our environment while relegating others to the background. As you can see in the picture, left side you have different sensations such as vision, hearing and all. So, that particular sensation when it is bombarded, there is a processing which happens in our brain, and you can see in the picture how this particular sensation gets processed in your brain and the output is the perception. That means, perception is the interpretation of what the sensation which we experience, and between the sensation and perception there is information processing which happens and then we interpret it. Now, let us talk about the process of sensation and perception. The transition from sensation to perception in a more complex and interactive way. We can understand the processes by dividing them into some steps, such as firstly, the stimulus which signifies that any change in form of energy in the environment and in the form of waves, sound waves, etc. Secondly, it is transduction, which we discussed, where electrical signals are changed into impulses that travel to the brain. Thirdly, the impulses from the sense organs go to specific areas of the brain, which we have seen it in the particular figure, where the impulses are converted into sensations. Fourthly, these sensations are sent to the associated areas of brain, and association areas changes the meaning and of less bits of information into meaningful and complete images, which we call it as perceptions. Our knowledge about the world helps us to make fairly accurate predictions about what should be there, so that we do not need a lot of information from the stimulus itself. Bottom up process are those which are involved in identifying a stimulus, and by analyzing the information available in the external stimulus, which also refers to information processing that begins at the receptor level and continues to higher brain centers. Top down processes are those which are involved in identifying a stimulus by using the knowledge we already possess about the particular situation. The knowledge is based on past experience and allows to form expectation about what we ought to perceive, and this also refers to information processing that begins in higher brain centers and proceeds to the receptors. When we are looking at a functional relationship between physical energy and psychological experience, such as how much intense must a stimulus be in order for us to perceive a change in intensity. In this context, it is very apt to discuss about the thresholds and how it affects our sensation. For example, if you are in your room where the main lights are already on and you add an additional light, then the perception of the brightness changes little. But if you start the room with almost dark and add some additional light, there is a large change in the perception of brightness. So, now let us talk more about this particular concept. Absolute threshold is a point at which stimulus can be detected 50% of time, and differential threshold is the minimal change in stimulation that can be reliably detected 30% of time, which is also called as just noticeable difference. Adding to it, signal detection theory suggests how individuals are able to detect a minimal stimulus among other background stimuli, which may influence how individual makes a decision in a very specific situation. Now, let us talk about principles of perceptual organization. During the early part of 20th century, Max Wertheimer published a paper demonstrating that individuals perceived motion in a very rapid, flickering static images, and this particular insight came to him while he used a child's toy called tachistoscope. Wertheimer and his assistants Wolfgang Kohler and Kurt Kofka, who again became their partners, believed that perception involved more than simply combining sensory stimuli, and this belief led to a new movement within the field of psychology known as Gestalt psychology. The word Gestalt means form or a pattern, but its use reflects the idea that the whole is different from some of its parts. And in other words, it says that our brain creates a perception that is more than simply the sum of available sensory inputs, and it does so in a very predictable way. Gestalt psychologists translated these predictable ways of principles by which we organize sensory information, and as a result, Gestalt psychology has been extremely influential in the area of sensation and perception. The processes by which we structure the input from our sensory receptors is called perceptual organization. The aspects of perceptual organization was first studied by German psychologists, where they said that innate tendencies of human mind to impose order and structure on the physical world and to perceive sensory patterns as well as organized wholes, rather than as separate isolated parts. In German, Gestalt means whole, as we already have seen that, rather than as separate isolated parts. Scientists have outlined several principles which can influence the way we organize basic sensory input into whole patterns, or we can say as gestalts. We can experience the principle of perceptual organization, which we also called as figure-ground relationship, which means we tend to divide the whole world into parts, that is, figure which has a definite shape and a location in space, and ground which has no shape but seems to continue behind the figure and has no definite location. The figure and ground relationship helps clarify the distinction between sensation and perception. Now you can see a particular figure over here, and you can see a vase over here. If you see the particular background, it is white in color and there is a particular pattern in black color. This is also called as Rubens vase. So, some people tend to perceive the vase instead of two faces, while some tend to perceive faces, but mostly we tend to perceive it as a vase rather than two faces, because the outline is more clear. The principles which are given by Gestaltists are not hard and fast rules, but are merely descriptions of ways in which we perceive the whole world around us. Attention by Gestaltists is often related to series of principles known as the law of grouping, which are the basic ways in which we group items together, and some of the ways we group information are called laws of grouping. Now, let us talk about the first law of grouping, which is called as law of similarity. So, as the name suggests, it is the tendency to perceive similar items as a group. The human eye usually perceives the components in a design as organized complete picture, shape or ground. Even if those elements are separated, the brain seems to bridge a link between the element of them which are similar to each other, and then we tend to see and interpret them in a relationship with each other, separating them from other elements in the design. As you can see in this particular picture, there are triangles and circles. When we first at a glance see this particular picture, we tend to group automatically, or our brain tends to group these particular pictures into triangles and circles. So, this is what law of similarity is. It tries to divide the elements based on the similar features. We might also use principle of similarity to group things in our visual fields. According to this principle, things that are alike tend to be grouped together. For example, when watching a football game, we tend to group individuals based on the colors of their uniforms. Now, let us talk about another grouping method called as law of proximity. It is a tendency to perceive items as located together as a group, and this often the simple shapes arranged together can create more complex image. When images or objects are close to each other, even when there is no connection with each other, they will be grouped under a single pattern or perceived as a meaningful picture. For example, if you see all these circles, as they are situated at a different pace or a space, we tend to group them under 3 groups rather than all the circles in a particular line. So, the way we read also gives us some clarity on the illustration of proximity concept. For example, when we read sentences in our day to day life, we tend to group it and read the letters of a given word together, because there are no spaces between the letters, and we perceive words because these are spaces between each word. For example, in the above picture, as I told earlier, all there, but because the space between the circles is different, we automatically tend to divide them into groups. Now, another law of grouping, we call it as law of closure. Gestalt psychologists claim that when we receive sensations that form an image or sound which is not complete or finished, we usually overlook it and perceive the image or sound as a complete or finished unit. Hence, this tendency to perceive as whole entities despite the fact that some parts may be missing or obstructed from the view. For example, in this particular picture, what do you see? Don't you see an aircraft? Isn't it? Even though if you see this picture, there are so many gaps in the aircraft, we are not viewing it as a separate parts, but we are viewing it together. And similarly, when we write on a board also and there are missing parts, so our brain automatically fills up that part and perceives it as a whole. So, this is called law of closure. Next is laws of common region. The tendency to perceive objects as a group if they occupy the same place within the plane. It also states that the objects which are usually within the identical region are perceived to be together. For example, if the circles are placed at a particular side of the particular plane, we tend to group it as the same. So, this is called the law of common region. Now, let us talk about law of simplicity. It is also known as the law of Prägnanz. In German, the word Prägnanz means a good figure. Hence, human eye likes to find simplicity and order in a very complex shapes, which prevents us from being overwhelmed by the information overload. The tendency to perceive complex patterns in terms of simpler shapes. For example, in this particular picture, when you suddenly look at the picture, you tend to observe that there are a lot of circles over here, but if you see the whole picture, it seems complex. Even though the picture is complex, your brain automatically tries to disintegrate them into a simpler one. For example, a group of circles forming a particular pattern. Hence, according to Gestalt theorists, pattern perception or our ability to discriminate among different figures and shapes occurs by the following principles described. And you will feel that perception accurately matches the real world, but this is not always the case. Our perceptions are based on perceptual hypotheses, such as educated guesses that we make while interpreting sensory information. These hypotheses are influenced by number of factors such as different personalities, experiences and expectations. We use this hypothesis to generate our perceptual set. For example, research has demonstrated that those who are given verbal priming produce a biased interpretation of complex ambiguous figures. In this context, Gestalt theories have been incredibly influential in the areas of sensation and perception. Gestalt principles such as figure ground, relationship, grouping by proximity or similarity, law of good continuation and closure are all used to help explain how we organize sensory information and a perception, which are not infallible and they can be influenced by, as said before, also through bias, prejudice and other factors. Hence, to sum it up, we can say that perception plays a very important role, and these principles of perceptions help us to organize information. So, let us summarize what we have learned. Sensation and perception play a vital role in attending and interpreting the situation. Sensations are based on a complex process within the nervous system, and it is through sense organs we tend to receive the first hand information. In order to experience sensation, the stimuli which we receive depends on various factors, and out of them some will reach the perception level. There are organized and interpreted means and ways for all perceptual sensation, which again plays a major role. There are some steps of transition by which sensation can be perceived. Coming to perceptual organization, it is a process by which we structure the input from our sensory receptors, which we call it as perceptual organization. There are various ways by which information perceived is organized based on some principles such as law of proximity, law of similarity, law of closure, law of common region, etc. Hence, the stimuli to be perceived by these laws or principles play a major role.